Hello everyone. Tonight we start off with a topic that is much more greasy and less intellectual. Junk meal from the Middle Ages. Yes, people still discovered ways to munch even in a world without hot dog vendors, vending machines, or fast food franchises. And let me tell you, it was all very medieval, some of it tasty, some of it unsettling. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Additionally, tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where you are tuning in from. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. Apple fritters were a rare victory in a world where most snacks tasted terrible and looked suspect. Like all excellent medieval choices, it was sweet, spicy, and a little risky. With the exception of the frosting and food safety regulations, these golden little pucks were the closest thing to a medieval donut. What precisely was a fritter in those days? Of course, apples. Not the glossy, gleaming supermarket sort, though. A neighbour's tree may or may not have yielded the little sour, knobby things that grew behind the alehouse. They were cut up and thrown into a rough batter composed of flour, eggs, and occasionally ale, because ale made everything seem a little happier, and water was always a gamble. The fry followed. In the 1300s, deep frying was a unique form of drama. Until it could most likely cast a ballot, the oil, typically pig fat, was recycled. To say that it added flavour would be an understatement, but the end product was something spicy, crunchy, and strangely irresistible. A freshly made fritter was a tiny bit of happiness. Soft centre, crispy edges with a slight chance of third-degree burns. It might be sprinkled with imported sugar if you were fortunate and wealthy, a luxury that also served as a social ploy. A drizzle of flavoured syrup or honey worked for everyone else. In any case, it was pleasant enough to take your mind off the rest of your diet, which consisted mainly of cabbage masquerading as other foods. The street food was fritters. When you needed a treat and didn't mind getting grease on your tunic, you would get one at a fair, after church, or during market days. Children adored them. They were adored by adults. The birds attempted to take them. They were quick, enjoyable, and decadent enough to take your mind off the pickled turnips that were waiting for you at home. Indeed, occasionally, the batter was suspiciously chewy. The apples were more sour than sweet, or they were overcooked. However, when they were good, they were excellent. After only one taste, you'll see why folks tolerated medieval existence. Cheese curds were the medieval equivalent of popcorn, if apple fritters were the medieval equivalent of a donut. Bite-sized, crazily variable, and a little squeaky. They didn't expand, they didn't melt, and they weren't showy. They hardly did anything at all, in fact. And they were flawless because of it. To be clear, medieval cheese had no intention of becoming famous on Instagram. It was prepared quickly, consumed quickly, and supposed to withstand lengthy trips, dubious storage, and the occasional goat walking on it. In essence, cheese curds were infant cheese. Before the wheel solidified, the early raw materials could be used as building materials. The process of manufacturing cheese produced these tiny clusters of dairy delight. Rennet, which sounds sophisticated until you understand it, originates from the lining of a baby animal's stomach, was used by farmers to separate milk into curds and whey. Hey, it did the trick! After being pressed and mildly salted, the curds were then... that was it. Curds of cheese. They had personalities. Sometimes they were rubbery, sometimes they were soft, and occasionally they squeaked on your teeth. However, they were strangely delicious, portable, and filling. Additionally, curds felt like a victory during a period when snacks typically consisted of cold broth or stale bread. Travelers packed them, and monks adored them. If the cows had cooperated that week, kids would eat them like sweets. You could eat them by the handful while feigning that they don't smell like the inside of a barn, or you could crumble them over stews or fried them. Cheese curds didn't need a feast or celebration. In contrast to many other medieval dishes, they weren't kept on saints' days or festivals. They were simply there, soothing. Known, not too chewy. When all else fails, the friend who always shows up is oddly dependable, yet never performs better than expected. Did they occasionally have an odd taste? Indeed, there existed a range of freshness during the Middle Ages, but most folks didn't mind if you were enthusiastic and salty enough. Besides, your standards automatically adapt to a world without refrigeration. Cheese curds were not glamorous then, however they were straightforward, filling and decadent enough to qualify as a treat. They were also great for bribing tiny children and cats in an emergency. Turnips aren't meant for dessert. That's where we should begin. However, someone, somewhere, saw a turnip and wondered, what if this were pie? In the medieval age, when sugar was costly, apples weren't always in season, and imaginative desperation was a significant food category. The turnip pie was created as a result. It wasn't always bad, to be honest. It was even somewhat positive at times. Imagine mashed turnips, ideally soft, mixed with a little egg, honey, or dried fruit, if the chef felt very generous, and baked under a solid crust composed of flour, water, and willpower. The outcome? Unexpectedly edible. It had that vaguely cozy root vegetable meats pudding sense, and at best it was warm and slightly sweet. At worst, it had the flavor of someone who had simply rolled in animal feed after mistaking it for a baking component. There were two key reasons why turnip pies were popular. Pie crust may conceal turnips that were overripe, undercooked, or suspiciously bitter, and turnips were inexpensive. They became aspirational peasant food after you cooked them into a pie and drizzled it with honey. Was it cheesecake? No. However, it made an effort, and in medieval Europe, effort was highly valued. These pies were served at feast tables, fairs, and in monasteries with a lot of excess root vegetables and a little too much time on their hands. Some recipes called for the addition of spices such as pepper if the cook was erratic, and nutmeg if the monastery was wealthy. Every now and again, raisins appeared, which only served to further perplex folks. Turnip pie was not eaten by nobles unless they were slumming it for amusement or feigning sympathy for the ordinary people for political purposes. For everyone else, however, it was sort of dessert. It's more like a pastry afterthought. Nevertheless, the turnip pie persisted in spite of its dubious reasoning. At the very least, they didn't despise it enough to quit producing it because they enjoyed it. It was inexpensive, substantial, and subtly sweet, which made it essentially innovative for medieval cuisine. The meat pasty, a portable pie filled with seasoned meat, wrapped in a folded dough, and baked till golden brown or faintly burned, was the comfort food MVP of the medieval world. Essentially a medieval hot pocket with a real sense of danger and without the microwave. The pasty's mobility was its greatest feature. Depending on the day, you may eat it while traveling, in the fields, or while seeing a public execution. Its thick pastry casing kept it warm for a long time and shielded its contents from dust, rodents, and the sneezes of peasants. Let's discuss that filling, though. In this instance, the phrase meat was ambiguous. You might acquire venison, mutton, or pork if you lived close to a hunting estate or manor, real, identifiable meat. If not, well, there were a lot more possibilities. Hedgehog, eel, rabbit, and pigeon. You could dice, season, and conceal anything that used to have legs or slithered within pastry with plausible deniability. Spices were frequently employed to provide flavor, or, more practically, to divert attention. Garlic, sage, and pepper were helpful, but they were unable to totally conceal the fact that the meat had been left to rest for a few more days than it should have. Nevertheless, a meaty pastry felt decadent during a period when refrigeration was unheard of and lunch was frequently just bread and onions. For those who were especially pious or on days when they were fasting, there were even vegetarian versions that were loaded with cheese, leeks, or root vegetables. Without a doubt, though, the meat ones were the most popular. They were hot, greasy, and cozy. You didn't inquire about its contents. You simply ate it, hoping the cook had been feeling upbeat. In case you were wondering, the crust was occasionally stamped with initials or other symbols to indicate who owned it, particularly among laborers and miners. The crust was extra thick along one edge in some areas, making it possible to hold it in filthy hands and then toss it to rodents, or, more realistically, ghosts. Were they decent then? Usually, yeah. Were they enigmatic? Always. However, that added to its allure. To feel safe, you didn't eat a meat pasty. You were willing to face the consequences, and you ate it because it tasted good. For medieval people, candied fennel seeds were the closest thing to mints, in a world where cleaning your teeth meant rinsing with wine and crossing your fingers. They had a single, strangely pleasant crunch and were little, sugary, and slightly herbal. They were a combination of dental hazard, digestive assistance, and reward. In the Middle Ages, it was no minor accomplishment to coat these tiny seeds in a hard shell of sugar. Someone, somewhere, had a genuine belief in the possibilities of these little nibbles, since sugar had to be imported, cooked, beaten, and poured by hand. They were particularly well liked in aristocratic homes where guests may be served a tiny portion of them to refresh their palates after supper, most likely to divert attention from the mutton that is still stuck on their molars. Fennel seeds had a powerful, licorice-like sharpness to their flavor. Either you nodded in appreciation or you graciously swallowed them whole out of love. Although the sugar covering was helpful, there was always that distinct herbal kick, the kind that makes you feel both upscale and a little lost. Digestion was another function of candied seeds. Fennel was thought to help calm the stomach, particularly after eating 3 different kinds of birds and a startling quantity of mead. Consider them to be chewing gum in the Middle Ages, crossed with Tums, but more likely to cause tooth chipping. Indeed, they were challenging. For example, if you're overconfident, crack your molar hard. Candied fennel seeds were not something you chewed carelessly. Before committing, you tested one carefully, bit down gradually, and listened for breaking noises. Every time, it was a risk-reward scenario. Although the wealthy popped them like medieval tic-tacs, the general public occasionally obtained imitations, which typically involved honey, crushed herbs, and nebulous hope. It's excellent enough to pass for the real thing, but not quite. Candied fennel seeds were a tiny but powerful addition to the vast array of medieval junk food. Even though you were soaked in mud and still had goose oil on your tunic, they gave you the appearance of refinement and left a wonderful taste in your tongue, even though they didn't fill your belly. The honey cake was the golden child of medieval delicacies, dense, sweet, and likely to adhere to everything but your expectations. When bakers became ambitious and sugar was still kept in a castle treasury, honey cakes were the result. If those folks had bees, had access to bees, or weren't scared to climb trees and get stung in the face, honey was the sweetener of the people. In an era when spoons were mostly employed to ward off siblings, these cakes were typically constructed with flour, water, and copious amounts of honey, or at least what constituted spoonfuls. The outcome? A solid, chewy slab that, depending on how long it had been placed close to the hearth, could be a fun snack or a temporary doorstop. Occasionally, when the household was feeling affluent or displaying their wealth, spices were added. Cinnamon, cloves, or nutmeg could add a little flair to the honey cake, by which we mean the capacity to get a whole village talking about your recipe for a week. If the dried fruits hadn't been taken by the neighborhood kids or made into wine, they were also thrown in. Due to their ability to be prepared in advance, their slow rate of spoiling, and their ability to withstand being dropped, trodden on, or thrown at someone in a light food fight, honey cakes were a common addition to feasts, festivals, and weddings. They were also occasionally used as passive-aggressive statements, presents, and bribes. I made this for you right here. Unlike your personality, it's pleasant. They weren't sensitive in terms of structure. A lot of them looked like compact bricks. A good knife and the silent hope that no one was observing your struggle were necessary for slicing them. It was simpler to eat them. However, don't anticipate a fluffy bite. Built for medieval living, these cakes are robust, long-lasting, and covered in enough gooey honey to make your hands feel like they've lost a war against a beehive. However, they were fulfilling. Like the infrequent times you weren't chasing rodents out of your closet or munching salty barley, they tasted warm and decadent. They had just enough chew to qualify as exercise, but they were bliss wrapped in sugar. Perhaps the most shockingly delicious snack to come out of a culture that also believed that eel pie was a good idea is fried fish skin cracklings. They weren't fancy, but these salty, crispy, tiny pieces worked well. Want not, waste not. Particularly when you're dealing with a fish that, to be honest, seems to be condemning you. Let's be truthful. This was not intentionally created. What if we just cooked it? More likely, some frugal cook was left looking at a stack of abandoned fish skins. History was formed after a spray of hot fat, or anything slightly edible came into being, particularly in coastal communities or along rivers where herring, cod, or whatever had been fished out of the water was processed immediately. Fish skin was abundant. The heads went to the cat and the meat to the stew pot. What about the skin? That sizzled into submission after being tossed into a pan of sizzling oil. The outcome was unexpectedly addictive, a crispy, thin nibble that tasted like concentrated salt water and crunched like a dry leaf. The experience was enhanced by a dash of salt. A touch of herbs or garlic? You were teasing culinary perfection then? These cracklings were useful in addition to being delicious, lightweight, fattening, and somewhat non-perishable. After a day of carrying firewood or protecting sheep from other sheep, this was just what a medieval body needed. Sailors subsisted on them, and soldiers packed them. For a few pence, peasants sold them outside of bars, enjoying the gratification of providing inebriated individuals with a louder conversation starter. Were their scales still present at times? Indeed. Did they sometimes twist into strange forms that caused you to reevaluate your decisions in life? Yes, too. But they were simply exquisite by medieval standards. It's tasty, crispy, and unlikely to make you sick. The one significant disadvantage? Take a whiff. From 3 huts away, these things could make their presence known. Your house would smell like Poseidon's laundry for a whole week if you fried a batch indoors. But since they tasted nice, you could get away with it. You didn't cry when life handed you warm beer and stale bread. You created bread soaked in ale, the quintessential medieval snack. This unassuming invention, sometimes referred to as trench toast or sops, was the first comfort food. Imagine a version of French toast without the eggs, sugar, cinnamon, or happiness. This is how it went. You took bread from yesterday, bread that might be used as building material, and dipped it in ale. It's not a sophisticated craft ale with a hoppy finish and citrusy aromas. No, this was a low-alcohol, flat medieval ale that had been produced with the hygienic attention to detail of a barn owl in someone's smoky-backed room. Like a trust-issued sponge, the bread soaked up the ale. It changed from a jawbreaker to something vaguely appetizing as it swelled and relaxed. Was it pleasant, in the proper lighting, with a positive attitude and modest expectations? Sort of, yes. It didn't actively insult the palate. It was warm, bready, and had the mild bitterness of fermented grain. The working class, who didn't have time for several courses or silverware but still needed calories that wouldn't fight back, were particularly fond of this snack. Ale-soaked bread was quick, filling, and just a little sloppy enough to make it feel like a real vacation from everyday tasks. If the hen felt generous that morning, people occasionally added extras, a fried egg, a little cheese, or a sprinkle of herbs. You might even get sops drenched in spiced ale on feast days, which essentially means the chef got inspired after discovering a nutmeg shaving. This meal, like many others from the Middle Ages, served two purposes. It served as both nourishment and a means of extending ingredients. Is the bread too stale to eat? Simply soak it. Ale turning already? Pretend it's deliberate and pour it on bread. Waste was meant for amateurs. The sole drawback: it was not a good ride. The bread became a sort of sloshy cube of porridge once it was wet. Eat it quickly or you risk a 1,000-year-old food metaphor for disappointment and a mushy sponge in your bowl. Still, nothing beats a piece of ale, bread mush, and some quiet time on a cold evening by the fire. Congratulations if you have ever looked at a piece of bread and thought, this would be better submerged in alcohol. There is a connection between you and the aristocratic elite of the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages, one of the more sophisticated, crimson, and oddly specialized treats was wine-soaked soaps, technically a dessert, or maybe an experience. The idea was straightforward. Dip some bread in wine, preferably toasted, or at least not totally stale. Of course, not just any wine, usually wine that has been spiced, sweetened, or mulled. It was warm, fragrant, and hardly disguised the fact that it had been stored since the previous harvest in a clay jar. The bread was offered as a soft, spoonable treat once it had been adequately soaked. The nobles referred to it as elegant. The others silently pondered whether the cook had just ran out of things to do. It wasn't finger food. It was the type of food you ate slowly with a spoon while feigning an interest in lute music. It showed up during banquets, late-night feasts, and the awkward dinners where people passed around wet toast in a goblet rather than discussing politics. Properly prepared, sops in wine were warm, cozy, and slightly intoxicating. A mild conclusion to a hearty dinner. The bread provided texture, the wine contributed richness, and the spices gave the impression that you were a part of something more elaborate than it actually was. It was like soggy bread in a bowl when done badly. The sensation that you were chewing on a medieval era could not be disguised by any amount of cinnamon. Occasionally, a whole egg, cheese, or dried fruits or nuts were added for decoration. It changed from being a snack to a gastronomic guessing game at that time. Peasants created their own versions, typically substituting ale or inexpensive vinegar for wine. Dessert wasn't served. It was breakfast, dinner, or whatever you choose to call a meal that left you feeling both stuffed and perplexed. Nevertheless, sops in wine were durable. Even though they tasted like sponge soaked in mulled sorrow, they were warm, filling, and provided medieval people a taste of pleasure. Because it was sugary, exotic, and shelf-stable enough to last a whole crusade, dried fruit was a highly valued treat during the Middle Ages. To be clear, though, this was not your typical contemporary trail mix in adorable resealable packaging. The sole purpose of medieval dried fruit was to endure. It was up to the taste, strongly chewy texture. Damage to the teeth is almost a given. Let's begin with the fundamentals. You had the standard suspects: dates, figs, raisins, and, if you were feeling very upscale, imported prunes. These fruits were no longer considered moist after being sun-dried, smoke-dried, or occasionally simply left on a windowsill. They resembled an edible time capsule from the previous harvest. They were rough, wrinkled, and startlingly dense. The benefit? The dried fruit has a very delicious taste. These withered little creatures were transformed into medieval confectionery by concentrated sugars. Monks treasured them, youngsters cherished them like rare kitchen plunder, and nobles adored them. The drawback? It felt like fighting your own jaw muscles when you chewed them. Medieval dental floss was made from the seeds of figs. You may glue your molars together using dates. For hours, raisins remained lodged in your teeth. No such thing as silent nibbling existed. Dried fruit did have its uses, though. To give the appearance of variety, it was cut up and tossed into honey cakes, added to porridge, or used in pies. As if to impress a Florence visitor, wealthy people may wrap them in pastry, pour rosewater over them, or soak them in wine. For ordinary people, obtaining dried fruit was a unique event, typically a wedding, a holiday, or the one day of the year that someone noticed you. Then you would eat it carefully and respectfully, maybe hiding in the barn to avoid having to share. It was simple to store because it didn't spoil easily. Dried fruit was frequently stored in clay pots or tiny fabric sacks. Yes, it hardened with time, but that only made it a more durable snack, or if you were resourceful and had younger siblings, a projectile. Dried fruit was delicious, opulent, and slightly hazardous, to put it briefly. Sometimes it literally stayed with you. You're hungry when you wake up. You're looking for something substantial, fried, and potentially retaliatory. Here comes the blood pudding ball, a medieval delicacy so substantial, so audacious, and so shamelessly iron-rich that it dwarfs the timid breadsticks of today. These savoury spheres, which were born out of the honourable custom of using every part of the animal, were evidence that you should not waste anything, even if it is blood. Let's dissect it. The first step is to obtain fresh animal blood, generally from pigs, but any blood will work in an emergency. After that, you combine it with oats, onions, suet, beef fat, and seasonings. The macabre porridge is shaped into balls and fried in sizzling grease till the outside crisps up, as if it has something to prove once it has reached the ideal level of gloomy stickiness. The outcome? For the remainder of the day, you will taste iron and mystery thanks to these dark, crunchy, protein-rich, earthy-flavored morsels. If your appetite surpassed your fear of congealed fat, you might eat them cold, but they were best served hot, straight from the skillet. Nobility may serve them with ale and eggs or dress them up with pepper. Peasants? All they wanted was to stop munching on boiling cabbage. Although blood pudding balls lacked style, they were useful, portable, calorie-dense, and surprisingly full. You can skip lunch if you eat two. You were most likely a blacksmith or attempting to win a dare if you ate four. At fairs, marketplaces, and roadside stands, where everything smelled of ambition and animals, these delicacies were typical. Since fried coagulation is a soul-warming food, they were particularly well-liked during the winter months. Blood pudding balls weren't for everyone, of course. The texture wasn't to everyone's taste. Others found the idea unappealing. However, these meaty little morsels deserved their spot in the medieval junk food hall of fame, in a world where survival mattered first, and flavour came somewhere about 13th. Put all of your knowledge about pancakes aside. These weren't airy piles of whipped cream and maple syrup. Pancakes from the Middle Ages were tougher, thinner, and baked in so much lard that your arteries would think about retiring early. However, they did the job well, and they were somewhat of a delight in a world when the only other breakfast option is thin soup that is depressed about its life. These pancakes, which were made with a simple mixture of flour, eggs, and either water or ale, were served on a sizzling iron griddle that was covered with bubbling pig fat. Don't use non-stick cookware. No portion control. All you did was ladle and hope. The outcome? An irregular, flat circular with a slightly chewy center and crispy, toasted edges. The type of pancake that would be largely edible when you got there and could withstand a horseback ride. It was a touch burned at times, it was a bit raw at points, charmingly, sometimes both. What you had determined the flavor. A pleasant tang was imparted with a splash of ale. a dollop of honey, opulent. A dash of onions or herbs, adventurous. However, it was usually just pancake and grease consumed hot and gulped as if you had just fled from a tax collector. They were democratic pancakes. They were consumed by all, monks, businessmen, peasants, and nobility. Some dipped them in soup, some piled them with cheese, while yet others simply rolled them up and went to bed. They can be eaten savory, sweet, or completely burned. Additionally, if you have leftovers, pile them high and act as though they were cake or armor. They were particularly well liked when meat was prohibited during Lent and other fasting days. Pancakes, fried, full, and yet modest, yet decadent, became a loophole. They were also great for hiding other things that shouldn't have been in your mouth. Furthermore, despite their lack of aesthetic appeal, medieval pancakes were durable. Praise was unnecessary for them. All they needed was a stomach and a hot pan. The medieval wafer falls somewhere between a snack and a sacrament. A delicate biscuit that hovered between dessert and oral challenge, thin, crunchy, and curiously light. There were wafers everywhere, in monks' hands at village fairs, outside churches, and sometimes floating in your soup like a flat holy crouton. Let's make everything clear. We are not referring to chocolate-covered treats with cream filling. Wafers from the Middle Ages were made primarily of flour, water, and eggs. You might add a little honey or rose water if you wanted to be fancy. Most, however, kept to the fundamentals. Like a medieval panini press, thin batter is put onto hot metal wafer irons and then pushed between two blazing plates. The outcome? It tasted like crispy paper with ambitions and had the appearance of something that would have been appropriate for a communion ceremony. Wafers were well liked because they were portable, quick to produce, and, most importantly, profitable when sold in large quantities. On feast days, vendors would erect their stalls outside of churches and wave stacks of hot wafers at the faithful as they departed Mass. Although it wasn't the catchphrase, the prevailing attitude was, "Buy now, sin later." Depending on the iron mold and the baker's level of fatigue, they were frequently formed with religious symbols, floral designs, or the hazy image of a saint's face. These designs gave you something to look at while chewing thoughtfully and acting as though you weren't let down, but they didn't improve the flavor. Wafers were delicate structurally. If you tried to break them properly, they shattered, and if you looked at them incorrectly, they fractured. Eating them outside was a high-stakes game, combining crumbs, wind, and remorse because they were difficult to store and even more difficult to move. They were still adored. Wafers were the medieval equivalent of pampering yourself without totally ruining your digestion or your finances. They were light, crispy, and somewhat festive. They arrived topped with soft cheese or heaped with fruit for the nobility. For everyone else, they were purchased in bulk from street vendors and consumed right away before they broke down into edible confetti. Screw it. The name itself sounds sticky. In essence, this medieval delicacy was fruit that had been submerged in syrup, simmered until it was tender, and then locked in a jar like a cute little captive. Imagine ginger, dates, or candied oranges that are so sugar-coated that your teeth will tingle and your conscience will tell you that you shouldn't be eating them. But since you had little else and it was tasty and most likely imported, you did. If it weren't for the average peasant munching on his 8th onion of the week, it would be awful. No, this was nibbling at the highest level, the type of decadence that was served in halls of state or given as a token of appreciation by the wealthy to say, "I like you, but not enough to give you land." Suck was saved for rare events like weddings or royal visits, or Wednesday if you were incredibly wealthy and uncontrollable because sugar was pricey and fruits weren't always in season. It was an ambitious preparation process. If your spice merchant owed you a favor, you would first boil the fruit in syrup, possibly honey, or refined sugar. Because one time wasn't enough, you would then drain it, allow it to dry slightly, and repeat more times. You were waging war on moisture itself, not simply on fruit preservation. The end product was a chewy, intense, glossy, jewel-toned candy bite that was so sweet that it could likely be used as a weapon in sufficient quantities. Some came in fancy glass jars and were soft and syrupy. Others were distributed as delicate little cubes of medieval hyperglycemia after being dried and rolled in more sugar. But don't get me wrong, it came with prestige. It claimed that you had trade channels, sugar, and at least one servant whose job it was to stir things that didn't want to be stirred. Following banquets, sucking trays were distributed like edible gold coins. The guests took one slice, grinned politely, and instantly wished they had taken 3. What about the average person? They observed from the kitchen, and if no one else was around, they might have licked a spoon. Was it worthwhile then? To be honest, sure. One of the few medieval snacks that actually felt like dessert was suck. It was opulent, sophisticated, and just rich enough to compensate for the boiled dish that had been part of the supper. The ultimate in medieval junk food is fried eel. From peasant hearths to royal feasts, this dish was so oddly popular that no one ever stopped to consider whether they were the best choice. Indeed, in medieval Europe, eels were commonplace. They virtually writhed in rivers and streams, were inexpensive to prepare, easy to catch, and unexpectedly crunchy when fried. Despite being slippery when raw, bonier than anticipated, and shaped like the antagonist of a horror film with a fish theme, eels were still consumed in large quantities. Why? It was delicious, and more significantly, it wasn't turnips. The first step in preparing it is to capture the eel, which is typically done at night when they are slithering through shallow water like sentient noodles. Then there was the disagreeable business of skinning them, which was more like battling a wet rope that refused to perish than preparing a fish. After being tamed, the eels were cut, seasoned if you were feeling adventurous, and thrown into hot oil until the meat solidified into something vaguely appetizing and the skin crisped up. The final item, like chicken and calamari having an identity crisis in a tavern kitchen, it has a rich, slightly greasy flavor and a crisp, savory bite. Roadside inns, feasts, fairs, and, believe it or not, religious fasts all provided fried eel. Yes, eel got past the dietary restrictions because it wasn't considered meat. Like itself, actually, it was consumed by monks, displayed by aristocrats, and exhibited at feasts by kings like the sea snake it had always aspired to be, stuffed into pies. Even though it had a lot of bones and occasionally wriggled long after it had died, fried eel was actually quite tasty if you could get past that, and the unsettling thought that you were eating a villain from a folk tale that served as a warning. Tender on the inside, crispy on the outside, and just greasy enough to give you the impression that you were living a bit too riskily for a Wednesday afternoon. It may appear strange nowadays. It was a delicacy back then, a slick little marvel that kept stomachs filled and menus interesting. Mesopotamia was at the intersection of myth and mystery in the ancient world, and their perception of dreams was one area where this was most apparent. Dreams were more than just a personal, pointless experience to the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians. Ignoring a magical email given straight from the gods to the subconscious, a divine telegram, it was akin to failing to read an Enlil message. Risky. Around 2500 BCE, the Mesopotamians had created a sophisticated dream interpretation system that was documented in cuneiform characters on clay tablets. These were employed in religious rites, medicine, and statecraft. They were not nighttime novelty items. If a disturbing dream hinted to impending doom, kings would postpone conflicts. If farmers saw a goat soar across the sky while they were asleep, they would not grow crops. They thought the world was speaking all the time. Your task was to close your eyes and listen. The ancient counterpart of Freudian psychologists, lacking the couch, were professional dream interpreters known as baru priests, libraries of omen literature such as the Ishkar Zakuk, a complex dream guide that classified dreams and their meanings in often ridiculous but uncannily accurate ways, served as their training grounds. Do you have a dream about eating dates? Good luck. Do you have a dream about losing your teeth? Anticipate death in the family. Do you want to have sex with a goddess? Congratulations then. Either you're blessed by God or you're plagued with conceit. These dream books made no pretense of speculating on significance. As though dreams were equations, they demonstrated cause and consequence. A and B are equivalent. Do you see a snake? Anticipate treachery. Drop from a roof? There will be a lawsuit. Dream logic was logical. It simply followed heavenly logic, which was very different from human logic. The Mesopotamians, however, went beyond interpretation. They also engaged in dream incubation. A monarch might sleep in a temple under particular conditions, including fasting, cleansing rites, maybe some incense offerings, and waiting for a revelatory dream, if he desired to receive counsel from the gods. According to the theory, some settings strengthened, clarified, and reduced the likelihood of having dreams involving inebriated goats. The dream realm was not a mystery to the Mesopotamians. It was a world to be traversed with prudence, respect, and an extensive collection of clay tablets. They thought that the gods were constantly communicating. To hear them, you simply needed to be asleep. Dreams weren't just something that happened at night in ancient Egypt. They were regarded as moving religious texts. Dreams, according to the Egyptians, could be messages from ancestors, the gods, or even one's own K or spiritual twin. All dreams, whether positive or negative, have a purpose. It might bless, warn, teach, or frighten. The Egyptians had started writing down their interpretations in what would turn out to be some of the first dream manuals in history by the time of the New Kingdom, which lasted from 1550 to 1070 BCE. The Ramesside Dream Book, which was found in the town of Deir el-Medina and written on papyrus, is among the most well-known instances. The reading wasn't light. In essence, it is a heavenly diagnostic instrument that lists hundreds of dreams and evaluates each one to determine if the outcome will be positive or negative. But the reasoning wasn't always clear. A man will become a senior official, for instance, if he dreams that he is eating crocodile flesh. Odd, indeed. However, the god Sobek, who represented might and strength, was associated with the crocodile in Egyptian mythology. To eat crocodile was to receive celestial qualities. That's a sign for a promotion. If a man sees himself was the opening line of each dream book entry, which was followed by a symbolic situation. It wasn't a broad guess. The interpretations were frequently binary, denoted as good or bad in red and black ink, and were derived from millennia of ceremonial knowledge, individual visions, and temple history. It was time to light some incense and ask a priest to step in if your dream was deemed unpleasant. Priests in temple complexes, particularly those who served healing deities like Thoth or Serket, occasionally provided dream incubation services in which supplicants would sleep inside the temple and wait for visions that would provide them with guidance or healing. Through prayer, purification, and regulated sleep, a divine conduit was supposed to be opened. This was more than just superstition. It combined theology, medicine, and divination into a single night's sleep. Magic and medicine were also impacted by dreams. In order to prevent recurrent nightmares, amulets may be recommended. Like erasing a curse, there are specific rituals that can be used to remove a dream. The sleeping intellect was not inactive in the eyes of the ancient Egyptians. It served as a stage for the appearance of gods, demons, and ghosts of the dead who may reveal secrets. If you were a priest and wise enough to decode them. Dreams were more than just heavenly whispers in the realm of ancient Greece. The encounters with the gods were clinical. The custom of incubation, in which people would sleep within a temple in the hopes of seeing a healing vision, was fundamental to this concept. And Asclepius, the god of medicine, was the deity most strongly associated with this practice. The sick, the optimistic, and the desperate came to Asclepiaia temples which were scattered throughout the Greek world, from Epidaurus to Pergamon, in search of healing. However, they were prescribed sleep, sacred, purposeful, and carried out under particular spiritual conditions rather than pills or potions. A person would be cleansed, bathed, fasted, and occasionally sacrificed an animal before entering the abaton, or sleeping chambers, of the temple. They could only lie on a stone bed and wait for the deity to show up in a dream after completing these rites. The outcomes? Inscriptions and historical accounts indicate that some patients had dreams in which Asclepius touched them with his staff, or in which snakes, his sacred animal, slithered over their bodies. They'd wake up and be healed, or at least think they'd had heavenly guidance on what to do next. The effects were significant regardless of whether these dreams were psychosomatic, genuine, or placebo-induced. Hippocrates and other Greek doctors recognized the importance of dreams in diagnosis. They weren't written off as foolishness. In fact, they thought symbolic visions were a way for the body to convey its status. A water-flowing dream could indicate kidney problems. A chest condition may be indicated by a dream in which you are crushed. Dreams were frequently categorized as either natural or heavenly in Hippocratic writings. Emotional stress, digestion, or food were the causes of natural dreams. Those of God, direct messages from the gods or the universe, fall under a completely different category. However, not all dream interpreters carried scrolls and wore white robes. The true stars of the public square were the dream readers, or onerocritae. They converted dreams into warnings, blessings, or directions using omens, dream manuals, and a vast amount of their own interpretive flair. The most well-known of these manuals was the Onerocritica, which Artemidorus of Daldis wrote in the 2nd century CE and is still studied today. Dreams were more than just a nightly phenomenon in Greece. They served as a link between the divine and the mortal, the body and the soul, and the healing process and illness. And if you were lucky, you may wake up with a snake curled at your feet along with a cure. One type of dream was more significant than all others in the ancient world: prophetic dreams. These were not merely messages, they were cautions, disclosures, or exhortations to take action. Prophetic dreams were revered messages from a higher plane, direct connections to gods, fate, or the enigmatic workings of the universe for cultures in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and beyond. Prophetic dreams were acknowledged and revered as a means of divine communication in the ancient Hebrew faith. Examples abound throughout the Old Testament. Consider Joseph, son of Jacob, who had a dream in which he saw wheat sheaves kneeling before his own, signifying his eventual ascent to power. He subsequently predicted 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine, while working as an interpreter of Pharaoh's dreams in Egypt. The course of Egypt's economy was changed by just one dream about plump, thin cows. By reading dreams, Joseph developed into a national strategist. Similarly, monarchs in Mesopotamia frequently had dreams that predicted success, misfortune, or heavenly favor. Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian monarch, asserted that he had visions of the gods that led him to victory in battle and rule. In a society where it was difficult to distinguish between a king and a divinity, prophetic visions were regarded as proof that a ruler possessed divine legitimacy. This prophetic potential was also recognized by the Greeks. Dreams were grouped into categories. Oneiroi alethinoi were those that revealed truth, whereas anhypnia were those that came from the subconscious. They weren't taken lightly. Greek officials frequently sought advice from dream interpreters or others before making important decisions, establishing a city, declaring war, or setting out on a journey. The Oneiroi, winged spirits who entered the sleeper's consciousness with messages from the gods, were considered to be minor deities because dreams were so highly valued. Prophecy was taken seriously even by the more realistic Romans. Even Nero sought the advice of dream interpreters during his reign, albeit perhaps not enough given the outcome, and the Emperor Augustus was reported to have dreamed of future glory. It is said that the ghosts of Scipio Africanus's ancestors sent him a dream of success prior to his victory over Hannibal. Prophetic dreams were not considered incidental in ancient society. They served as evidence of divine choosing, instruments of policy, and means of power. Something as basic as a whispered vision in the dark frequently marked the beginning of stories, the health of empires, and the fate of nations. Ancient dream incubation was not limited to Greece, despite the fact that Greek Asclepian temples are the most well-known. A rich fusion of Hittite, Phrygian, and later Greco-Roman traditions flourished in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, where temples and other sacred locations were devoted to enabling sleep-based communication with supernatural forces. The most intriguing example is found in the worship of Men, a Phrygian lunar deity connected to cycles, healing, and, of course, dreams. As though positioned to capture lunar messages beaming down into supplicants' dreams, his temples frequently stood atop hills with their faces toward the night sky. People would visit these shrines to engage in ritual slumber and incubation in the hopes of obtaining a healing or guiding dream if they were experiencing medical illnesses, spiritual distress, or doubt about their destiny. Although Anatolian incubation had its own twists, the procedure was comparable to what we observed in Asclepian customs. Worshippers believed that being close to holy geometry would focus divine messages. Therefore, they would occasionally sleep beneath celestial engravings or traverse labyrinthine trails. Chant, music, and incense were frequently employed to help the sleeper's thoughts align with the divine frequency. This was sleep as spiritual receiving rather than sleep for rest. Dream priests, spiritual experts qualified to lead and interpret these visions, are also mentioned in local texts. In order to influence the meeting, some would even seed dreams by presenting symbols or imagery before going to sleep. For instance, someone may place a carved fertility idol beneath their pillow while they sleep in order to have a glimpse of their future child. The priest might announce the arrival of a courageous boy if they had a dream about a lion. If they dreamed of rain, they would have a daughter who was endowed with intelligence and progress. Dreams of divine encounters are frequently mentioned in Hittite chronicles, particularly among aristocrats. In their slumber, the gods sent kings and queens wisdom on strategy, knowledge about healing, and sometimes stern warnings. An early instance of heavenly diplomacy is said to have occurred when a queen was told in a dream to adopt a foreign goddess into her temple. In Anatolia, dream incubation was a collective and cosmic process rather than only a personal one. Long-distance pilgrims frequently established transient healing communities, united not by blood, but by a common fragility and optimism, and they felt that the gods might change their lives via sleep. Dreaming was not a passive activity in Anatolia, rather it was a ritualistic activity in which prophecy and healing came from the silent language of sleep rather than from reason. One individual, Artemidorus of Daldus, decided to formalize the old skill of dream interpretation, which had developed into a disciplined craft by the 2nd century CE. The Onera Critica, the most extensive and significant dream guide in antiquity, was written by Artemidorus, a Greek from Asia Minor. Additionally, Artemidorus treated dreams with the systematic precision of a scholar and the curiosity of a streetwise psychologist, in contrast to mystical scribes who shrouded everything in divine mystery. The Onera Critica was a 5-book work published in plain Greek that contained thousands of dream scenarios and their interpretations, drawn from public performances, temple records, and personal interviews. It was not some mystical booklet. According to Artemidorus, he gathered dream reports from warriors, sailors, merchants, prostitutes, and individuals from all walks of life for decades. His reasoning? Listen to a culture's dreams to get a sense of its spirit. He categorized dreams into acts, occupations, animals, classifications, biological processes, and even relationship types. Flying in a dream could be interpreted as either a sign of freedom or conceit. Depending on your socioeconomic class, having a dream about being nude in public could represent either shame or future power. When teeth fell out in a dream, it signified a loss, generally, of a family member. It appears that one has endured over the ages. However, Artemidorus's emphasis on context is what sets him apart. Artemidorus emphasized the significance of the dreamer's rank, gender, occupation, and present life circumstances, in contrast to previous dream books that provided unchanging meanings. When a rich guy dreamed of a shipwreck, it signified trouble for his business. If a poor man had the same dream, he might become wealthy. Interpretation was customized rather than universal, akin to early psychotherapy. Artemidorus also directly addressed symbols. He realized that irony and metaphor were used in dreams. Dying in a dream could represent rebirth rather than death. Desire was not always implied by a dream of sex. It could be an indication of guilt, power struggles, or domination. His interpretations straddle the boundary between being utterly odd and profoundly rational. The Oneirocritica was not merely a curiosity, it was in use for centuries throughout the Byzantine world and the Roman Empire. It was translated into Arabic and had an impact on medieval dream interpreters, sustaining the flame long after the collapse of classical temples. The dream became a manuscript to be studied with Artemidorus, deciphered not only for insight, but also for prophecy. Even if he didn't think dreams were from gods, he did think they were from a deep, weird, and worthwhile place. In the ancient world, not every dream was a divine gift. Some were dreads from the depths, gloomy, eerie visions thought to originate from the abyss itself, demonic powers, or restless spirits. These were considered more than just restless nights. They served as omens of impending events, warnings, or penalties. The Babylonians were among the first to distinguish between dreams that originated from evil forces and those that were inspired by God. A priest would be asked to execute apotropaic rites, cleaning spells, offerings, or symbolic activities intended to counteract the impact of a dream if it produced dread, disease, or distress. For instance, the interpreter would suggest burning cedarwood incense to ward off evil spirits, or sleeping with a protective amulet beneath the pillow if the dreamer described being pursued by a demon. Additionally, the Egyptians had a sophisticated concept for preventing nightmares. It was thought that some dreams were brought on by evil forces, such as the deceased. To fend off these invasions, people wore amulets with the eye of Horus, or pictures of Bez, the dwarf deity who guarded homes from evil powers. To regard the nightmare as a contagious curse that needed to be spoken out of existence before it could materialize in the practical world, some people even performed spells to erase their dreams when they woke up. In Greek philosophy, nightmares frequently represented a message from chthonic deities, the gods of the earth and the underworld, rather than the Olympians. In dreams, Hades, Persephone, and even the dreadful Irene's furies could show up to convey divine wrath or warn of an unpunished crime. Dreamers were at risk if they disregarded these cautions. In the Republic, the philosopher Plato even characterized the dream as a battlefield where the lower aspects of the soul were at war with reason and appetite. He saw the nightmare as a psychological warning that your inner self was out of harmony, in addition to a spiritual one. As pragmatic as ever, even the Romans dreaded seeing certain creatures in their dreams, such as wolves, snakes, or owls, since they believed that they were warnings of death, treachery, or war. They held that the dead may occasionally warn or accuse the living through dreams, Nightmares were more than just horrible dreams in every culture. They were viewed as cosmic red lights, warnings that there was no real escape from fate, even while you were asleep, and that the visible and invisible worlds were always interconnected. Dreams were considered political assets in ancient times, in addition to being spiritual. Dreams were frequently used as a weapon by rulers, priests, generals, and prophets to support choices, influence public opinion, or establish power. Those in positions of authority were quick to claim that the gods spoke to them while they slept. Consider the case of Alexander the Great. He supposedly had a dream in which the deity Amun welcomed him as a son before he overthrew Egypt. When they reached the Siwa oasis, the local oracle verified the dream and proclaimed Alexander to be a celestial child. Did the dream come true? Did it get staged? It made no difference. In the perspective of his soldiers and subjects, the message cemented his authority and portrayed him as a living deity. Dreams were particularly helpful in uncertain or political times. Augustus, who defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra at Actium, claimed to have dreamed of a great victory in ancient Rome. Later, this dream became a hallowed story when it was captured on coinage. Emperors after him did the same. Who could stand in your way if the gods were behind your dream? Oracles and priests frequently contributed to this. When dream reading served the goals of a monarch or temple elite, it developed into a religious tool. Let's say a dissident governor had a bad dream. It could be interpreted by the priest as divine retribution for opposing imperial authority. Conversely, when properly read, fantasies of success and prosperity may inspire politicians to launch campaigns, increase taxes, or implement reforms. Men weren't the only ones who did this. According to temple inscriptions, Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt stated that the deity Amun appeared to her mother in a dream and predicted her birth, bringing with it the promise of divine reign. She bolstered her legitimacy in a male-dominated throne by portraying her reign as predetermined in dreams. In the Hebrew Bible, prophets also opposed monarchs through dreams. For example, Daniel predicted the rise and fall of empires by interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream about a large statue. Dream reading wasn't all that it was. It was metaphor wrapped around geopolitics. Dreams enabled leaders in every civilization to declare that this was the will of heaven, not just their own. Dreams were a potent currency that transformed the subconscious into statecraft, one vision at a time, whether they were the result of heavenly revelation or deliberate propaganda. The legacy of ancient dream interpretation endures, reverberating through time, science, and psychology, despite the fact that the old temples have fallen and the dream priests are now sleeping beneath layers of dust. Ancient frameworks that attempted to explain the sleeping mind are the source of much of what we currently believe about dreams, our interest with symbolism, recurrent themes, and even nightmares. These customs were completely passed down to the medieval era. The Oneiro Critica of Artemidorus was refined and expanded upon by Islamic scholars who translated it into Arabic. Dreams were revered in Islamic mysticism as a source of heavenly direction. In the meantime, theologians and Christian monks started recording saints' and martyrs' dreams, which frequently foretold future miracles or divine justice. Sleep was still seen as a gateway to the sacred, dreams as hidden messages, and interpreters as the link between the divine and the human. In spite of his rejection of religious interpretations, Sigmund Freud, who lived in the 19th and 20th centuries, made extensive use of the symbolic structure that had been established thousands of years before. Freud maintained in the Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1899, that dreams were a manifestation of suppressed fears and wants, but he continued to employ archaic techniques such as metaphor, symbolism, and storytelling. Carl Jung, his protégé, went farther, stating that archetypes, universal figures like the shadow, the hero, and the wise old man that resembled figures from a Babylonian omen list or a Greek temple, were present in the dream world. Even contemporary neuroscience acknowledges the complexity of dreams while depriving them of their mystique. Lucid dreaming, REM sleep, and the impact of memory or trauma on dream content. These theories are in line with long-held beliefs that the status of the soul and the physical health are both reflected in dreams. Pop culture continues the tradition as well. Dreams continue to be fascinating in everything from literature and movies to tarot and New Age spirituality. The age-old notion that what we see while we sleep matters still pulsates beneath everything, whether it's a horror movie about sleep paralysis or a dream journal app that promises self-discovery. Ultimately, even though the ancients lacked sleep labs and brain scans, they were able to understand something that we still seek today. Dreams are not arbitrary. They are murmured in the language of our ancestors, the gods, or ourselves. They are tales, signs, or shadows. The question doesn't change over time. What message is your dream attempting to convey? The United States was a nation that was bursting at the seams in the middle of the 19th century. Despite having been a state for 10 years by 1860, California frequently felt more like a distant relative than a sibling. While the western frontier remained rocky, isolated, and agonizingly disconnected, the eastern half of the country was humming with towns, railroads, and telegraphs. It could take 3 to 4 weeks to send a letter from New York to San Francisco, and occasionally more if there were delays, robbers, or storms, and if it ever came at all. At the time, mail routes were both ineffective and complicated. The most popular route was for ships to transport mail across the Panamanian Isthmus, down the Atlantic, and back up the Pacific coast. This trek was fraught with logistical challenges, delays, and tropical diseases. In contrast, the stagecoach journey overland was sluggish, dangerous, and often hampered by muddy paths, snowbound passes, or outlaw attacks and unfriendly terrain. This delay was a political issue rather than only a minor annoyance. The federal government was concerned that California may lose its spirit or allegiance as it became more and more isolated. Keeping the continent united was not only ideal, but also vital in a time when secession was already imminent. The idea of establishing a central relay system using the one resource the American West possessed in large quantities, open terrain, and swift horses, was the most audacious option put forth by entrepreneurs and dreamers. Delivery times may be shortened from weeks to only 10 days if proficient riders could gallop across the nation in turns, switching horses at stations every 10 to 15 miles. It was a crazy idea. The trip from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California would cover around 2,000 miles. It would traverse rivers, mountains, deserts, and hardly mapped areas. Extreme heat, icy nights, and the constant threat of ambush would all be there. However, it would be the quickest route of communication between the East and the West if it succeeded. The issue was obvious. America's infrastructure was not keeping up with its rapid expansion, so, one saddlebag at a time, a solution raced into history with a combination of desperation, ambition, and pure frontier courage. The birth of the Pony Express was imminent. The Pony Express did not appear out of thin air. 3 aspirational businessmen from the freight and stagecoach company Russell, Majors, and Waddell came up with the idea. The 3 men, William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell, were already seasoned overland transportation professionals and were based in Missouri. Their business was in charge of transporting government supplies and freight across the untamed frontier. However, in 1860 they set out to achieve a much more ambitious objective, delivering mail to California as quickly as possible. Russell, in particular, was under pressure at the time. Financial scandals and failing ventures threatened his reputation. In addition to being a patriotic act, he viewed the Pony Express as a kind of personal atonement, a means of clearing his name and winning government favor. They intended to secure a big government postal contract if they could demonstrate the effectiveness of their relay system. The logistical brain was brought by Alexander Majors. He was a pious and careful planner who insisted on strict discipline from his staff, even making station managers and riders take oaths not to drink or swear. For the Express, he also created a very organized system. The entire route would be maintained like a military operation, with larger home stations spaced every 75 to 100 miles and stations constructed every 10 to 15 miles. The quietest member of the three, William B. Waddell, supplied the financial and legal support. Waddell maintained the numbers and made sure the business remained afloat, at least temporarily, while Majors was the operational genius and Russell was the salesman. The three invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in the business together. They constructed about 190 stations in the most isolated areas of the frontier, employed over 80 riders, and purchased over 400 horses. They were aware that the path would be difficult and that it was a gamble. However, they were also aware that the person who resolved the communication problem would be immortalized in American history. Thus, they started the service on their own without any help from the government. Although it was a risky financial and logistical decision, it was also a powerful representation of American perseverance. The Pony Express was prepared for travel in April 1860. It was a race against terrain and time. Establishing the Pony Express route had virtually little tolerance for mistake and was akin to constructing a precarious bridge across a continent. From St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, the entire journey covered almost 2,000 miles, passing through a bewildering variety of terrain, including high deserts, mountain ranges, rolling plains, and perilous river crossings. The founders constructed a chain of roughly 190 relay stations, spaced 10 to 15 miles apart, to make this crazy notion work. This is roughly the distance a horse could travel at maximum speed before tiring. The riders were given respite and shelter at house stations every 75 to 100 miles, where they might eat, sleep, and pass the mail to another rider. However, the Express's more than 400 horses served as its true foundation. They were picked for their extreme speed and endurance rather than their appearance or size. Fleet-footed thoroughbreds dominated the prairie in the east. Mail was transported across the desert and mountains in the untamed west by little, resilient Mustangs. These were the frontier's Ferraris. It would only take a few seconds for riders to gallop at full speed, jump off mid-stride, and jump onto a new horse. Every station has to be secured, provisioned, and manned. Some were merely wooden shacks or sod homes. Others were fortified buildings with barbed fence and rifle-wielding station keepers on duty. Food, feed, water, and supplies had to be transported beforehand. This required months of planning, and it had to be carried out in some of America's most isolated and hostile territory. One of the main dangers was the weather. Riders would have to brave the harsh summer heat on the Nebraska plains, sandstorms in the Utah desert, and snowstorms in the Sierra Nevada. Everyday dangers included collapsed trails, flooding rivers, and wild animals. Then there were risks to people: outlaws, bandits, and the escalating hostilities with Native American groups. However, the system functioned in spite of the chaos. The mail was able to travel across the continent in as little as 10 days, which was groundbreaking at the time, with riders switching every 75 to 100 miles and new horses every 10 to 15. It took guts, sweat, and unadulterated will to pull off this logistical marvel. One hoofbeat at a time, the Pony Express sewed together a tenuous thread of connection in a place where distance meant loneliness. The Pony Express made its historic premiere on April 3, 1860. A hive of excitement filled the stables of the Pikes Peak Stables facility in St. Joseph, Missouri. Though records are somewhat disputed, the first rider, likely Johnny Fry, mounted his horse, grabbed the leather machilla, a specially made mailbag, and sped out westward at a rapid pace. A new chapter in American history suddenly came to life when the crowd shouted and the guns fired. Letters, newspapers, and telegrams headed for California were all in the mailbag Fry was carrying, which weighed around 20 pounds. The combination of technology and unadulterated human labor was symbolized by a telegraph message that had previously been wired from Washington, D.C., and would now be carried the remaining distance on horseback. The bidirectional relay was started at the same time by a counterpart in Sacramento who rode eastward. They intended to traverse the approximately 2,000 miles of wilderness, 190 stations, and some of the most difficult terrain in North America in 10 days. In less than 2 minutes, each rider on the route jumped from a lathered horse and onto a new one, carrying the mochila from one station to the next. The mochila was cleverly made. It could be easily put over the saddle horn without unstrapping anything, and it featured 4 secured compartments. It was all about speed. Even in the dead of night, riders were supposed to keep up a speed of 10 miles per hour, whether they were traveling through dangerous territory, rain, or snow. The initial ride was successful in spite of the pandemonium. In 9 days and 23 hours, the mail from Missouri arrived in Sacramento. A victory. The legend of the Pony Express was developed almost immediately as newspapers praised it as a marvel of contemporary communication. Even though that initial mochila simply had a few letters, it had a huge symbolic impact. Getting mail from point A to point B wasn't the only thing involved. It was about demonstrating that man and horse could overcome separation, and that this untamed, broken continent might be united. It was the start of an exciting and perilous chapter for the bikers. It was a taste of something new for the country, instant communication that was faster than anyone had ever imagined. The West had simply shrunk somewhat. The mochila, the stations, or even the horses weren't the Pony Express's lifeblood. In order to deliver the mail, a group of young, wiry adventurers known as the Riders braved the elements, the wilderness, and conflict. They were more than just messengers. They were becoming living legends. Usually around 16, the average Pony Express rider was no older than 18. Typically weighing less than 125 pounds, they were lightweight to avoid adding weight on the horses. It was all about endurance and speed. According to the now famous recruitment advertisements, they were looking for young, wiry, slender males under the age of 18 who were willing to risk their lives every day and were preferably orphans. The sentiment behind it was very real, even though the phrase is probably apocryphal. Changing horses at each station, these young men rode 75 to 100 miles per shift without stopping until they had passed the mochila to the next rider. They frequently rode through intense heat, snowstorms, or torrential rain at night. They carried guns and revolvers, but their greatest defense against hostile attacks or bandits was speed. Many of them relied solely on their skills to outrun trouble while traveling alone and without weapons. A few horsemen rose to fame as folk heroes. Despite being wounded by arrows, Pony Bob Haslam reportedly rode 380 miles in less than 2 days to deliver mail during a bloody Paiute revolt. Although historians question the veracity of that allegation, William Buffalo Bill Cody, who would go on to become a Wild West showman, claimed to have ridden for the Express at the age of 15. In any case, reality was dramatic enough as it was. Riders had to brave areas where the smallest mistake may result in freezing, drowning, or disappearing completely, as well as traverse the Great Basin Desert and rugged mountains. Nevertheless, the service continued to have a high dependability rate. Only one mochila was ever lost, even under the most severe circumstances. Many riders enjoyed their jobs despite the risks. They enjoyed the rush, the speed, and the sense of accomplishment, and they were paid well for the time, between $100 and $150 a month, which is a small fortune for a teenager. They were knitting the nation together, not merely riding mail. The Pony Express's passengers were more than just couriers. With every hoofbeat, they galloped through myth and memory, representing American bravery, tenacity, and endurance. And they demonstrated that no frontier was too great to overcome for 18 months that will never be forgotten. Being a Pony Express rider was more than simply a job. It was a daily risk of death. the riders encountered a series of dangers that would have caused most adult men to retreat. Nevertheless, despite the fury of nature, armed adversaries, and a region that frequently looked intent on engulfing them, these primarily adolescent guys persisted. The environment itself posed one of the most enduring threats. Riders had to brave scorching temperatures in the Nevada desert, blizzards in the Sierra Nevada, and unexpected thunderstorms that may transform dirt roads into impenetrable muck or flood river crossings. Hypothermia could result after slipping off a horse in sub-freezing temperatures. In a flooded river, one mistake may result in drowning, and several people came perilously close. And then there came the creatures. Mountain lions hunted the high passes, rattlesnakes coiled in trailside bushes, and packs of wolves occasionally pursued riders at night. However, bandits and bushwhackers who understood that a rider's mochila held valuable letters, some even laced with money orders or gold dust, were even more deadly than wildlife. Despite having revolvers, the horsemen were outnumbered, and stopping would have put their lives and mission at jeopardy. During the Pony Express's brief history, tensions among Native American tribes also boiled over. Numerous attacks on Pony Express stations occurred in 1860 as a result of the Paiute War, which was brought on by land disputes, unfulfilled promises, and settler expansion. Station keepers were killed, riders were ambushed, and several stations were destroyed by fire. The most well-known incident included Pony Bob Haslam, who, after being wounded by arrows, rode a horse across difficult country for almost 190 miles in order to deliver the mail. Isolation was dangerous too. With only their horse, their weapon, and the approaching darkness, riders were frequently left alone for hours at a time. A wounded horse, a damaged leg, or a missed station could mean that you die in the wilderness and are never recovered. Nevertheless, they rode. The system persisted in spite of everything. Rarely was mail lost, but it was delayed. Although riders suffered injuries from time to time, they nearly always survived. Only a few workers were killed on the job over the 18 months of operation. The Pony Express was not a Wild West myth. The reality was harsh and frequently frightening. However, by persevering through these perils, the riders rose to fame, demonstrating that even the most harsh terrain could be subdued, at least long enough to carry the letter. Despite the Pony Express's brief 18-month existence, it had an immediate, significant, and unquestionably wide-ranging effect on the U.S. The Express made one point very evident in a nation that was on the verge of civil war and desperately needed to feel united across its huge territory. Distance was no longer fate. Letters from the East Coast to California took weeks to get there before the Pony Express. Personal news, business transactions, and significant political choices frequently came too late to have any impact. However, mail could get to San Francisco in 10 days because to the Express. All of a sudden, Californians were in step with the rest of the nation. Companies became more audacious. Near real-time updates from all throughout the country might be reported in newspapers. Families were more intimate. Most significantly, the Union felt closer to one another, which was crucial as the Civil War approached. In terms of politics, the Express also gave the central government confidence that the West was accessible. At a period when fragmentation felt perilously close, it stood for unity and national might. During the anxious months before Lincoln's election, the Express helped provide President James Buchanan with frequent information from California. In terms of the economy, it contributed to the development of transcontinental infrastructure. The stations, constructed across isolated terrain, later used as the locations for stagecoach routes, railroads, and telegraph lines. Later, a large number of Pony Express lines would be incorporated into longer-lasting communication networks. What started off as a daring gamble ended up serving as the model for connecting America's coasts. Additionally, the Pony Express came to represent the spirit of the frontier in culture. Newspapers made the motorcyclists into heroes right away by romanticizing them. All around the nation, young men aspired to assume control and charge through peril while carrying a saddlebag full of fate. The Express captured the imagination of a nation in need of emblems of bravery and solidarity, and even as it worked, it became mythologized. The Pony Express influenced American identity long after it was over. It stood for quickness, bravery, selflessness, and most importantly, potential. In a little more than a year, it succeeded in bringing a divided, dispersed country together, something that steamships, Congress, and diplomacy had failed to accomplish. One gallop at a time, the Pony Express carried the future, not just the mail. Despite its courage and success, the Pony Express was doomed from the beginning. It was a technological issue rather than a failure. Nothing could match a wire's speed, which was as quick as a horse could ride. Construction of the transcontinental telegraph, a coast-to-coast communication line that would send communications in minutes as opposed to days, started just 2 days after the Pony Express's formal opening in April 1860. From California, the telegraph cables and poles moved steadily eastward, and from the Missouri River westward. Each mile of wire was another nail in the Express's coffin. Only 18 months after the first ride, on October 24, 1861, the last telegraph wire was placed nationwide. The connection was made instantly once the system went operational. The Pony Express transported its final letter that same day. Morse code clicked rhythmically, replacing the quiet of hoofbeats. However, the Pony Express was losing money even before the invention of the telegraph. It was a commercial failure despite its iconic performance. Despite investing over $700,000 in the venture, Russell, Majors, and Waddell hardly received any of it back. The Express was never a viable business model due to its high operating costs, horses, riders, station maintenance, and supply logistics, as well as the lack of a federal subsidy. As a daring advertisement for a postal contract that never materialized, it was constructed as a proof of concept. The business started to fail, and Russell himself was embroiled in a financial controversy. The Express was already dying, courageous, adored, but totally out of date by the time the telegraph was finished. But there wasn't much resentment at the end. The Pony Express had accomplished its main objective, which was to demonstrate that quick, coast-to-coast communication was feasible. Stations were repurposed or abandoned, riders found other frontier jobs, and the country looked to the future. The Pony Express's demise was a passing of the mantle rather than a failure. Similar to how the wire would eventually give way to radio, satellites, and the internet, the horse gave way to the wire. For a single brilliant moment, however, America marveled at the triumph of strong horses and teenage boys over time and space. The Pony Express strode into folklore and left footprints that no telegraph wire could ever remove in a society that was fixated on speed. Despite barely lasting 18 months, the Pony Express became one of the most memorable and idealized tales in American history, galloping directly into the mythology of the American West. In actuality, it was a brief and hazardous commercial endeavor. However, it evolved into something much more in the public consciousness, representing bravery, speed, and the unwavering spirit of the frontier. School textbooks, penny novels, and Hollywood made the Express a legend. The nation was moved by the picture of a lone rider silhouetted against the sunset, thundering across the prairie while carrying a six-shooter and a leather mail pouch. This was a movement of national identity, not merely nostalgia. The Pony Express told a tale of bravery, selflessness, and perseverance in the face of adversity at a period when America was still figuring itself out. People like Buffalo Bill Cody and Pony Bob Haslam rose to fame on the frontier. In his Wild West concerts, Cody capitalized on the legend, whether or not he rode for the Express. This helped to solidify the image of the courageous juvenile courier in the imaginations of millions of people worldwide. For Americans, the Express became a symbol of courage, fortitude, and everything they wished to believe about their pioneer heritage. Soon after, there were monuments. Cities along the historic trail from St. Joseph to Sacramento now have statues of prancing horses. The original route is now traced by highways and bike routes. The memory is preserved by historical tours, museum exhibitions, and reenactments. Even the United States. Pony Express stamps have been released by the Postal Service to commemorate the short-lived yet audacious venture that brought the country together. However, there's a deeper reason why the narrative persists. The Pony Express takes us back to a time when the challenges of nature and human endurance were in a head-to-head race. When connecting took bravery and communication meant taking a chance, it teaches us that speed used to come from sheer willpower and a readiness to ride through snow, desert, and darkness with just a horse and a dream rather than from satellites. It's easy to forget how difficult communication used to be in this day and age of instant messaging and international networks. The Pony Express is a monument to those who used strength, determination, and a racing heartbeat rather than fiber optics or electricity to span impossibly long distances. It outran the impossible for a fleeting and brilliant moment, which is why its mythology endures rather than because it endured. The first beer ever discovered was not packaged in a labeled bottle or a cold mug. Long before Rome flourished or the pyramids were built thousands of years ago, it appeared in a clay pot in the center of a Sumerian hamlet. The Sumerians, who lived in ancient Mesopotamia, were making beer in both utilitarian and religious ways. They weren't merely sipping it either, it was being worshipped by them. In Sumerian culture, beer was more than just a light drink. It served as a staple food, money, a sacred sacrifice, and a representation of civilization. The fact that the oldest recorded recipe in human history is for beer rather than bread or soup is no coincidence. The hymn to Ninkasi, which was discovered on clay tablets from circa 1800 BCE, honors the goddess of beer while also providing verse-based brewing instructions. Ninkasi was no small god. She was admired. Making beer was a way to call her. It was a poetic and pragmatic brewing technique. Bapir, a unique bread made from barley and frequently combined with honey or dates, was baked by the Sumerians. After that, the bread was crushed into water-filled jars and allowed to spontaneously ferment. The end product has little in common with beer today. It was more akin to a wholesome gruel, thick, hazy, and low in alcohol. It was also necessary for day-to-day living. In the ancient world, water was frequently tainted, but beer was safer because of its fermenting process. Because of its high calorie and nutritional content, it became an essential component of the diets of both laborers and priests, as well as members of the royal family. Beer rations, which could total several liters per day, were commonly used to pay laborers on irrigation canals or temple construction projects. Beer was a socially shared activity. People frequently gathered around enormous pottery pots and drank via long reed straws, sifting off the silt instead of using cups. It was more than just being wasted. It was about surviving, forming bonds, and even paying respect to the gods. Beer played a significant role in defining Sumerian identity in numerous ways. It was ingrained in economy, agriculture, law, and ceremonies. It was a spiritual deed as well as a daily necessity, liquid civilization. Additionally, it prepared the way for brewing cultures to spread throughout the ancient globe, from the Nile's coasts to the banks of the Tigris. If beer had a mystical origin in Sumer, it was industrialized by the Egyptians. Beer was more than just a holy beverage by the time the Old Kingdom was emerging along the Nile. It was a cornerstone of Egyptian culture, permeating everything from religious offerings and burial customs to everyday meals. The scale of Egyptian beer brewing exceeded that of previous techniques. Huge breweries functioned as a component of the state economy at expansive temples and royal complexes. In actuality, religious organizations frequently oversaw the manufacture of beer. Beer played a significant role in rites honoring goddesses like Hathor, the goddess of music, fertility, and joy, which is often linked to drunkenness and celebration. The Egyptians believed that beer was a gift from Osiris, the god of agriculture and fertility. Though it had changed in scale and technique, the brewing method was comparable to that of the Sumerians. After being partially baked, bread prepared from barley or emmer wheat was crushed into big vats and combined with water. The mixture was allowed to ferment in pottery jars after dates or honey were added for sweetness. The result was a thick, unfiltered, and nutrient-dense beverage that was occasionally spooned rather than drunk. It was not just the living who drank beer. Along with loaves of food and meat, tombs were filled with jugs of beer for the afterlife. Beer was seen as so necessary that it was impossible to envisage a dignified voyage to the hereafter without it. Its spiritual significance is emphasized by recipes for the deceased, lists of beer sacrifices to the gods, and murals depicting the brewing process. But the labor market was also fueled by beer. Slaves were not employed to build the pyramids. Beer, often up to 4 liters per day, was part of their daily diet as paid laborers. This was not a luxury. It included nourishment, hydration, and morale. It was even dubbed the ancient Egyptian energy drink by one archaeologist. Production and distribution were strictly regulated by the state. Beer was subject to taxes and quality controls. Brewing was frequently done by women, particularly priestesses and temple employees, which strengthened its association with both holy authority and home life. To put it briefly, beer was not a side item in Egypt. It was in the middle. It filled the tombs, fed the populace, and appeased the gods. Additionally, it permeated every aspect of Egyptian life, much like the Nile itself. Throughout history, beer was more than just a beverage. It was communion with God. Its bubbly presence was welcomed into celebrations, funerals, and temples. Fermentation was viewed as a supernatural metamorphosis, a gift from the gods that transformed ordinary grain into a holy liquid rather than as a chemical process. Making beer was a way to engage with the spiritual realm, and drinking it was a way to engage with something beyond mere nourishment. The goddess Ninkasi represented this bond in Sumer. Her hymn was a devotional act and a guide to holy brewing, prayer, and instruction. Chants to call her into the ritual probably preceded the fermentation process. The last beer may have been distributed to priests, offered as part of temple gifts, or even poured out in libations to the gods themselves. Beer's spiritual application was even more deeply ingrained in Egyptian religion. For daily offerings, temples brewed their own beer, often devoting hundreds of jars at once. Worshippers commemorated the tale of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of devastation who was duped into consuming red beer that was meant to look like blood during the yearly festival of drunkenness. The outcome? Humanity was spared, and her bloodlust was numbed. The story of beer's physical ability to subdue heavenly anger is a compelling one. Numerous religious writings mention certain ritual brews meant for rites, and priests and priestesses actively participated in the brewing process. Another important aspect of burial customs was the inclusion of alcohol. It was thought to help the soul get to the next world. In addition to prayers and hymns, some tomb inscriptions even specify exact beer contributions. Seasonal celebrations outside the temples frequently featured widespread group drinking. These were no informal gatherings. They were acts that brought the divine and human worlds together. Beer served to blur the boundaries between the everyday and the magical, whether it was for a solstice, harvest celebration, or memorial service. Beer continued to have spiritual overtones even in later societies, such as the Hebrews or the Hittites. Beer retained its ancient status as a sacred and grounding element, although wine acquired popularity in elite rituals. Beer was still associated with fertility, the earth, and the working class. Beer consumption in ancient times was not solely motivated by thirst. It was about bringing oneself into harmony with the cycles of life and death, the gods, nature, and cosmic rhythms. The invention of beer was not limited to civilization. It might have contributed to it. Some archaeologists and historians now contend that early agriculture and settlement were motivated in part by the desire to manufacture beer. Although grain was undoubtedly cultivated for bread, there is growing scholarly evidence that suggests people may have started growing cereals in part to produce beer. Beer is not merely a product of civilization, if this is accurate. It is among its foundational elements. Evidence indicates that barley, one of the first domesticated grains, was valued for its fermentable sugars as well as its food value in ancient Mesopotamia, where organized farming first emerged. After being harvested, barley could be ground, stored, and used to make beer and bread. Additionally, fermented beer was safe to consume and could be kept for a longer period of time than water, which was frequently contaminated. For early populations, it was therefore crucial, particularly in dry or semi-arid areas where water supplies were erratic. A certain amount of social organization was also required for the manufacture of beer. Brewing calls for precise scheduling, regulated temperatures, storage containers, and necessary equipment. This promoted early science, technical progress, and the division of labor. Ancient brewers had a sufficient understanding of fermentation processes to reproduce them reliably, as evidenced by clay tablets. In a time without yeast packages or thermometers, this is no small accomplishment. Breweries were incorporated into the governmental and temple economies of cities such as Uruk and Babylon. Workers, soldiers, and administrators were given beer rations. Grain or beer could be used as a form of taxation, and as beer was associated with both religion and the economy, its production was strictly regulated. Accordingly, brewing played a role in the development of record-keeping, bureaucracy, and standardized weights and measurements. Additionally, beer had a key role in the expansion of trade networks. Areas possessing excess grain and brewing expertise traded beer, ingredients, and brewing implements with nearby societies. Beer may have been a valuable product to carry, as evidenced by pottery jars containing fermented beverages discovered in Levantine and Egyptian trade sites. To put it briefly, beer facilitated human settlement, organization, and well-being. Grain farming was justified, workers were fueled, cities were connected, and rights were promoted. The bubbly drink was much more than a dessert. It was liquid infrastructure that, sip by sip, was laying the groundwork for the ancient world. Beer was the purview of women even before breweries were industrialized or recipes were documented. Brewing was a domestic craft that was almost solely undertaken by women in many ancient societies, rather than being a male-dominated occupation. Brewing was also seen as a sacred and expert craft that was passed down from mother to daughter like an ancestral recipe, rather than a menial kitchen task. Beer and femininity were so intertwined in Sumerian culture that Ninkasi, the goddess of brewing, was a woman. This was not a symbolic act. The fact that Sumerian women were the primary brewers in both residential and temple settings was reflected in it. In the past, baking and brewing frequently took place concurrently and both required fermentation. Women produced the food and beverages that kept the home and society going, while males managed trade and politics. Brewing was still dominated by women in Egypt, particularly in the household. Water, flavorings, and lightly baked loaves of grain were used to make beer in clay pots. Although labor-intensive, the procedure was standard. For the benefit of their families as well as for sale or barter in nearby markets, many women brewed on a daily or weekly basis. Small-scale breweries were run by female employees or servants in wealthy homes. Women are frequently shown making, filtering, and storing beer in tomb paintings and hieroglyphics, underscoring their crucial involvement in this important aspect of life. Brewing for ceremonies and temples also involved a lot of women. Sacred batches intended for offerings or religious celebrations were frequently supervised by priestesses and temple employees. Brewing was a source of spiritual influence and social standing in some areas. These women were stewards of holy tradition, not only chefs. Men started to dominate public brewing as societies got more stratified and beer became more marketed. However, women were in charge in the early years of beer's history. They created the procedures, oversaw the materials, and preserved the information. It's interesting to note that remnants of this custom persisted throughout the Middle Ages. Alewives, or women who manufactured and sold ale from their houses, were among the first brewers in Europe. To stand out in the marketplace, some donned tall hats, a detail that would eventually be warped into the archetypal picture of a witch. A woman with a brewpot, however, was not viewed with suspicion in the ancient world. People respected her. One bubbling jar at a time, she fed both gods and mortals. There was more to ancient brewing than luck and magic. It was a craft that had been honed over many generations by combining environmental knowledge, experimentation, and observation. Although there were differences throughout cultures, the fundamentals of brewing were surprisingly universal: time, fermentation, water, and grain. But the details, it becomes interesting at that point. Although emmer wheat was also widely utilized, particularly in Egypt, barley was the main grain throughout much of the ancient world. These grains were picked because they naturally provided the sugars and enzymes needed for fermentation, in addition to being readily available. For brewing, grains were typically partially malted, steeped in water, and given time to germinate before being crushed into mash or baked into bread loaves. These bread loaves, known as bapir in Sumerian, were crushed into enormous porcelain vats that were filled with water in both Mesopotamian and Egyptian customs. After stirring and occasionally boiling the mixture, it was allowed to ferment. The fermentation process was started by naturally occurring yeast in the air or in the containers themselves. Although no one understood what yeast was, they were aware that it was effective and that some containers produced better beer, most likely due to the presence of leftover yeast colonies. Brewers used herbs, spices, honey, or dates to flavor or sweeten the beer. In instance, Egyptian beer was frequently sweet and viscous, resembling liquid porridge. Filtering was not required. Straws were used to consume some versions in order to prevent sedimentation. Others were so nourishing that, particularly for the poor and laborers, beer was regarded as a meal unto itself. One important factor was temperature. Brewers in hotter regions such as Egypt and Mesopotamia meticulously planned their work schedules and controlled the temperature using cool storage pits or shaded courtyards. Beer was sometimes matured in clay jars that were sealed, while other times it was intended to be drunk right away. Large clay jars, wooden paddles, woven sieves, and even stone hearths for heating were all used as brewing implements. Each batch was somewhat different, and everything was prepared by hand. However, the information was transmitted verbally or ceremonially and was kept through prayer, song, and repetition, such as in the Ninkasi hymn. Ancient brewing methods were highly developed adaptations to regional climates, grains, and cultural tastes rather than being archaic. They exhibit not only culinary prowess but also a close connection to time, nature, and change, a sort of alchemy in which water and grain were transformed into a revered social potion. Beer's function grew far beyond the home or temple as it became an essential part of everyday life. Beer was more than simply a drink in many ancient societies. It was also a commodity, money, and a source of income. Beer was directly woven into the fabric of ancient commerce, from state levies to worker wages. Beer was an essential part of the ration system in Mesopotamia. As part of their regular wages, laborers such as farmers, builders, and even scribes received daily rations of beer. By rank, the quantity and quality differed. Beer for workers was thicker and coarser, whereas beer for higher officials was more refined. These allocations are detailed in cuneiform tablets, and beer transactions are documented in thousands of ancient receipts, demonstrating that alcohol was just as significant to the economic ecosystem as grain or silver. The actual process of making beer became a profession. Breweries needed a small army of workers, grain collectors, millers, bakers, fermenters, and transporters. They were frequently affixed to temples or estates. Certain localities developed localized trade networks and regional styles by specializing on beer production. These beers could be transported in clay jars that were covered with cloth or wax, but they weren't bottled and delivered like they are now. Beer was exchanged for wool, ceramics, and olive oil by traders. The situation was similar in Egypt. Large quantities of beer were produced on both rural estates and urban areas. State granaries frequently housed breweries, and the products they produced financed laborers, military, and temple operations. Like any critical resource, beer was tracked, taxed, and stocked. Beer even evolved into a bartering tool during difficult times, replacing little cash. Long-distance trading also involved beer. As far away as the Levant, Cyprus, and Nubia, clay containers containing remnants of barley-based brews have been discovered, indicating that fermented drinks were traded with upscale goods. Beer continued to be the beverage of the masses, permeating every transaction from village markets to temple disbursements, even though wine would soon take center stage in elite marketplaces. Beer's perishability and mobility make it a nationally significant yet distinctively local economic product. Priests, merchants, farmers, and artists all benefited from its manufacture. It was state infrastructure as well as daily subsistence. To put it briefly, ancient beer was not only drunk, but also tallied, exchanged, saved, and spent. It supported empires, financed temples, and helped construct pyramids. A microcosm of civilization was hidden beneath a mug of beer that might have cost a few copper cents. Beer was the great equalizer in the old world. Not everyone drank the same type, but everyone drank it. The strict social hierarchies of the era were mirrored and perpetuated in beer, just as they were in cuisine, dress, and language. The elites transformed beer into a status symbol, a ritual offering, and occasionally even a political instrument, while the general populace drank thick, hearty brews to survive. Beer rations were given to laborers every day among the Akkadians and Sumerians. Their black, unfiltered, and viscous concoctions were more stew than drink, but they were also quite nourishing. These were practical beers designed to keep workers hydrated in hot, dry weather. But there was diversity even here. According to quality and purpose, some tablets list at least 9 different kinds of beer. The fact that the better varieties were frequently kept for administrators, priests, or scribes indicates that class distinctions were already being made with beer. The disparity was even more pronounced in Egypt. The elite drank sophisticated brews that were lighter, sweeter, and occasionally filtered, while the average Egyptian drank a thick beer produced from emmer wheat and flavored with dates. Tomb paintings show servants pouring from graceful jars, as lords sit beneath palm fronds with goblets of golden beer. For the affluent, beer was an aesthetic pleasure as well as a source of nourishment. Every day, beer was offered to pharaohs and their families, frequently with bread and wine. These drinks were a reflection of authority, not just custom. Only the wealthy could afford the best ingredients, a dedicated brewing crew, and the time to enjoy beer as a pastime rather than rely on it for calories. Additionally, beer was used for ceremonial and diplomatic purposes, offering premium beer during feasts, treaties, or religious celebrations was a display of respect and affluence. Not providing beer that can be interpreted as offensive. Curiously, this division was reflected in the brewing industry itself. Slaves or women usually brewed the family's supply in households and villages. However, production was managed by professional brewers, occasionally, with training and a salary at temples or affluent homes. Beer from temple vats was more politically significant, better taxed, and more regulated. Beer was therefore ubiquitous, yet depending on who you were, its flavor, texture, and significance varied greatly. It was daily fuel for some. Others saw it as a sign of riches, refinement, and divinity. Ancient beer, which frothed at the rim, brought with it not just flavor, but also a subliminal mark of social standing in each jar. The tradition of ancient brewing endures in our recipes, customs, economics, and cultural memory, even though it has been thousands of years since Sumerian priestesses sung to Ninkasi or Egyptian laborers drank beer under the shadow of pyramids. Perhaps no other beverage evokes the first manifestations of civilization as much as beer does. The ancient world has a lot to teach us about brewing now. Brewers without microscopes or thermometers invented many of the methods we use today, like as malting barley, fermenting with wild yeast, and flavoring with fruit or herbs. Instead, under the direction of spiritual reverence and oral wisdom, they depended on tradition, intuition, and trial and error. These techniques laid the groundwork for what would later be known as scientific brewing. Cultural traditions also retain the antiquated view of beer. Groups still brew beer in ceramic pots in areas like Ethiopia, Peru, and rural Eastern Europe. These groups frequently use family past recipes that are reminiscent of Sumerian and Egyptian kitchens. Like it was 5,000 years ago, brewing is a communal rite in many areas rather than merely a pastime or business. Beer's symbolic significance has persisted as well. Around the world, beer continues to be a staple at festivals, holidays, and social events as a beverage of celebration, camaraderie, and identity. Beer serves as a bridge between people, and the communal pint at the pub embodies the same spirit as the ancient Sumerian clay pot shared by reed straws. The study of ancient brewing has given rise to a burgeoning academic discipline called bioarchaeology. Scientists have recreated old beer recipes, produced them, and even marketed them using residue analysis. Modern people may now literally taste history thanks to experimental archaeology initiatives that have successfully produced beer using recipes from ancient Egyptian tombs. Most significantly, ancient beer serves as a reminder that civilization was not solely based on steel, stone, or conquest. Additionally, it was constructed in breweries and kitchens by common people who transformed water and grain into economy, culture, and nutrition. It was presented to the gods, made by women, and eaten by laborers. The next time you raise a glass, keep in mind that you are engaging in one of the oldest and most universal human rituals, a tradition that has been created over millennia and is still fermenting in every part of the world, rather than just sipping a beverage.